I love the Isle of Wight. This is my favourite festival. I would always say a huge yes, big hint, if ever invited back again. And, you know, as Maurice mentioned, I'm working on my 17th book now, which is going to be out next September. So just, if I could put a little marker down for next year. But it's an absolute delight. Thank you so much for coming out in such numbers to listen to me this afternoon on this beautiful day. I've left the rubbish weather behind in London. The sun always shines on the Isle of Wight. I'm convinced of that. And yes, so I've had to go back in time. Well, I always have to go back in time, but in terms of my own memory for my talk this morning, and it's actually really special to have reacquainted myself with this remarkable woman, Henrietta Howard. She was the subject, as Maurice said, of my first ever book. And I completely fell in love with her when doing the research. There are 5 beautifully bound volumes of Henrietta's letters in the British Library. And they read like a novel. It is such a dramatic story. She's not the best known woman in history. You may be thinking, who on earth is this woman, in fact? But I think she deserves her place in the spotlight. So thank you to the festival for inviting me to share her story with you today. So Henrietta Howard, who was she? She was one of the longest suffering mistresses in royal history. She was the mistress of a Prince of Wales, later King of Britain, for almost 20 years. Not many other mistresses can claim that particular record. She was a Norfolk woman. She was born at Blickling Hall. Some of you may know that. It's in North Norfolk, absolutely beautiful, largely Jacobean hall. It also claims a more famous royal woman and the birth of Anne Boleyn. It was at Blickling Hall. I think Hever Castle has finally given up that battle. For years it said, no, Anne Boleyn was born here, but I think now it's conceded that actually Anne was born in Blickling Hall, and then she moved to Hever Castle. By the way, it's my ambition to get through an entire day without saying the words Anne Boleyn, and I've never actually... There you go, she even makes it into a talk about Georgian England. But Henrietta Howard was born at Blickling in May 1689. 1689 was an interesting year in the history of the British monarchy. So the joint monarchs, William and Mary, had just been ushered to the throne in the so-called Glorious Revolution the previous year. And in 1689, William and Mary signed the Bill of Rights. This is very significant in the history of the monarchy because it's at that precise moment when the monarchy goes from being a monarchy who is in charge of the country to one who really only has the appearance of power. It becomes a constitutional monarchy, and Parliament really is running the show. So 1689, I would put in a pitch for that being one of the most important dates in our history, arguably more important than 1066, the one that everybody knows. So just hold on to that. It's very useful in pub quizzes, etc. 1689, and it was the year, as I said, of Henrietta's birth. She was the daughter of Sir Henry Hobart, it is spelt, but it was pronounced Hubbard. Sir Henry Hubbard, he was a swashbuckling kind of man. He'd fought in various military campaigns. He was a larger-than-life aristocrat and very hot-headed, very volatile in temper. And he was always picking quarrels with his local neighbours in Norfolk, usually about politics, because he ran for Parliament. And in 1697, so when Henrietta was just 8 years old, her father picked a particularly bad quarrel with a neighbour called Oliver Leneve. And they were opponents in a local election. And Henrietta's father got so angered by Oliver, his neighbour, that he challenged him to a duel. Now, when researching my book on Henrietta, I tried to, and I eventually succeeded, find the very spot where this duel was fought in North Norfolk. It's now behind an Esso garage on the A341. It did take me a little while to find it, and the spot is actually marked by this monument you might just be able to make out on the right-hand side there. Well, there's good reason why this particular duel has its own monument, because it would be quite a famous duel in the 17th century. So on the face of it, it was going to be easy for Henry Hubbard. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was a military man, as I mentioned. Oliver Leneve had no military experience. He'd never even held a sword. It was going to be a duel by sword. And he was left-handed. He had all sorts of disadvantages. So if you were a betting person, you'd have betted on Henrietta's father, Sir Henry, and you'd have lost. Because in the very first thrust of the sword, Oliver Leneve ran Sir Henry through in the belly, and he died of his injuries just 2 days later, which left Henrietta and her 8 siblings, including her brother John, an orphan. Well, not quite an orphan, but certainly fatherless. And she was an orphan just 2 years later when her mother died. And so Henrietta was one of the oldest of the Hobart children. And so she really took care of her siblings. And she became very, very close to her brother John during those turbulent years of her youth. They moved to Gunnersbury Park in West London for a time because they had fallen on hard times. As well as his terrible temper, her father hadn't been very good at looking after his money. So Henrietta and her siblings were very much in debt, and they had to go and stay with a relative in Gunnersbury Park. Well, when Henrietta reached the age of 17, she decides to take matters into her own hands. You know, this can't continue just living on the charity of one of her relatives. So she thinks it's high time she found a husband. And on paper, the man she chose was perfect. He was Charles Howard. He was a younger son of the Earl of Suffolk. And so, great family, good connections. He was a few years older than her, very good looking, tick, 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 you can imagine. Yes, this is going to be a great match. So Henrietta, with nobody really to negotiate this for her, arranges her own marriage. And they marry very, very quickly at the church of St. Paul's Bennet Wharf in the city of London. So Henrietta's just 17, remember. Well, you know what they say about marry in haste. She repented it very, very quickly. Poor Henrietta. She had had no idea of her husband's true character. There's literally nothing good to say about Charles Howard, except clearly he's got charm, because he'd managed to convince Henrietta that he would make a good husband. But he liked to drink, he liked to gamble, and he was very violent. And Henrietta certainly suffered at the hands of his violent rages. And what little dowry she had brought to the marriage, her husband soon gambled away. So in fact, Henrietta found herself in worse circumstances than she'd been when she was living on the charity of relatives at Gunnersbury House. Now, she was pretty much penniless and forever on the run from her husband's creditors. Throughout London, they were always having to move house. Well, very soon into the marriage, within a year of marrying Charles Howard, Henrietta had given birth to a son, Henry. And he seemed to be the sole light of her life in this miserable time of her existence. Things became so bad that Henrietta even considered selling her own hair. Now, during the course of my research into this book, one of the most heart-stopping moments was when I was in the archives of Lambeth Palace, the archives of the Archbishop of Canterbury, no less. And I came across this. a lock of Lady Suffolk's hair. She was later Countess of Suffolk. As you can see, it's kind of chestnut brown colour. Why it ended up in the possession of the Archbishop of Canterbury, I never did manage to find out. But Henrietta didn't actually, in the end, sell her hair. She was offered 18 guineas for it, but her husband scoffed. That was more than the hair was worth, and in the end she decided to save up some money by other means, taking in needlework, whatever jobs she could get. Why was she trying to save money at all? Well, this was for a very good purpose. Queen Anne was now on the throne. The year is 1714. Queen Anne, it is clear, does not have long left to live. And despite being pregnant 17 times, Anne leaves behind no living child. Her last child, a son, had died a few years earlier. And it's a very tragic history for poor Anne that despite all of this, she wasn't able to leave a direct heir to inherit the throne after her. She will, in fact, be the last Stuart monarch of Britain. There will be no other Stuarts to follow her. So who is going to take the crown next? Well, all eyes are on Germany, because Parliament has decreed that the throne has to pass to a Protestant. So the closest Protestants they can find are the electors of Hanover. And here you see Electress Sophia, who was in line to inherit the throne from Queen Anne. She was the granddaughter of King James I. He inherited the throne from Elizabeth. But it was almost like a battle between these two elderly ladies. Who could last the longest? Because Sophia isn't in good health either. Queen Anne, as I said, her health is failing. But Sophia does have a son and heir, George Louis, who is going to be Elector of Hanover when she dies. So if Sophia doesn't outlive Anne, then her son will be King of Britain as well as Elector of Hanover. And this is where we get to Henrietta and her need to raise money, because anyone who's anyone in Britain at this time is trying to raise money for a voyage to Hanover so that they can ingratiate themselves with the future royal family of this country. And Henrietta, you've got to admire her. She always takes responsibility for her own fate. It's not typical for a woman at this time most women are very subservient to their husbands who really dictate their lives. Whereas Henrietta, she's already married, admittedly not well, to try and rescue her family. And now she's raising money for a voyage to Hanover. And thanks to taking in this sewing work, needlework, other jobs that she can get, she does manage to get together enough money for a voyage to Hanover for herself and her husband, Charles. Charles happens to find her hidden stash of savings, and he spends the whole lot in the gambling halls one evening, so she has to start all over again. But eventually she does, and in the early months of 1714, she and her husband journey over to Hanover, and they present themselves at the Palace of Herrenhausen. This is the electoral palace, as you can see, rather a lavish affair, and really they have to join a long queue of people who've come over from England, and they're all trying to get a promise of positions at court once the Hanoverians have taken the throne when Queen Anne is dead. Well, Henrietta clearly has something about her, because you notice her. You know, she's not one of those sort of women who fade into the background. She's a very intelligent woman, very well-read, articulate, charming, courteous, and she quickly makes a good impression at Herrenhausen, so much so that she wins favour with the woman on the right there. She is Caroline of Ansbach. She is married to George Augustus, who will be the Prince of Wales. So this is going to be the new Prince and Princess of Wales. And Caroline promises Henrietta a position in her household if her father-in-law, George Louis, becomes king of Britain. Well, somehow Henrietta's husband, Charles, also manages to get himself a position at court. I'm not sure how he did it, but he appeals to the elder George Louis, who is set to be king. And so George Louis appoints Charles, and then the Princess of Wales, as she will become, appoints Henrietta. So husband and wife are serving in two different households. Electress Sophia dies just a few weeks before Queen Anne. So it is indeed her son George who now becomes King George I of Britain. And he's not very happy about it. He doesn't really want to come to Britain. He spends most of his reign travelling back to Hanover, which he makes no secret of far preferring. Meanwhile, the Prince and Princess of Wales, as they are now, they go out of their way to charm the people of Britain, and they really set up a rival court to the king. You'll find this in the history of the Hanoverians. Fathers hate sons all the way through. And it's said that the Hanoverians were like pigs. They trample their young. And it certainly was the case. So you have these two rival courts now in Britain. The court of the king, George I, and the court of his son, the Prince of Wales, and his charismatic wife, Caroline. So now Henrietta faces a choice. She's going to have to choose whether she goes with her royal mistress and serves in a completely separate household and palace to her husband, who is serving the king. And you might think, well, that's an easy decision because, her husband is a drunk, he's violent, Henrietta has suffered at his hands for years. But it's an agonizing decision for her because she knows if she leaves her husband behind, she also leaves her son, Henry. In those days, it is the husband who has the right to custody of the child or children. And eventually, Henrietta decides she's just so miserable in this marriage, she is going to leave. And heartbreakingly, she doesn't really see her son again because her husband raises young Henry to hate his mother, Henrietta. So it's the great tragedy, really, one of the great tragedies of Henrietta's life. But she is at least fortunate in her employment. She is one of the brightest stars of this new Hanoverian court. She is very charming. As I mentioned, she quickly has won favour with her royal mistress, Caroline, who also fancies herself as a bit of an intellectual. She fills her court with poets and playwrights and scientists and artists. And Henrietta really thrives. Well, when the court enters its kind of summer phase, it tends to go on progress. This has happened for many hundreds of years. And the prince and princess like to spend their summers in the heart of Richmond Park, in White Lodge. It's still there today. It's a ballet school today, in fact. And it was very much the favoured retreat of the Prince and Princess of Wales. Well, something quite important happens one summer, the summer of 1718. So Henrietta has been in service now at the royal court for 4 years. And it's almost certainly during that summer that she begins serving not just the Princess of Wales, but the Prince of Wales, should we say. There are rumours of an affair between Mrs. Howard, Henrietta Howard, and George, Prince of Wales. And certainly Henrietta has a lot of admirers at court. This is an early engraving of Henrietta, and it differs from the one that you saw right at the beginning. You might notice her hair colour has changed. She's most often depicted as being blonde, but in fact, as you saw from that lock of hair, she has brown hair, but she was known to lighten it because of the Prince of Wales' weakness for blondes. She used horse's urine to lighten her hair, I'm afraid. Sorry to lower the tone, but that's how they did it in the Georgian period, and it was all for the benefit of the Prince of Wales. So it's pretty certainly during this summer when Henrietta becomes the prince's mistress. And you might think, okay, we're talking royal affair here, so it's passion, it's secrecy and all the rest of it, longing. It's none of those things. Can I just disabuse you immediately? We're not talking about a conventional royal affair between Henrietta Howard and the Prince of Wales. The only reason George decides to take Mrs. Howard as a mistress is because he thinks that's what British royal princes do. And he wants to fit in. So it's said that he sees a mistress as a necessary appurtenance, and he just wants to uphold royal tradition here in Britain. So he'd better take a mistress. Who is he going to choose? Well, Mrs. Howard is known for her discretion. She's not going to make any trouble for him. And she has something else that turns out to be quite an advantage, because poor Henrietta, from as early as being in her 20s, has started to lose her hearing. George is one of the most notorious bores in the whole court. He is obsessed with detail, with routine. He can recite the family trees of the European dynasties going back to the 1100s, and he will recite them every evening over dinner. And he's obsessed with regiments, and people just obviously don't tell him how boring he is because he's the Prince of Wales, but he is notorious for that. He also cannot cope if anything disrupts his daily life at court. So everything is run with clockwork, regularity, and precision. He even has, and believe me, this was one of the best moments in my research when I discovered that he had his underwear numbered according to the days of the week. So he had to wear the same set of underwear on a Monday, and then on a Tuesday it differed. This is how precise he was. And if anybody disrupted even a tiny detail of his daily routine at court, then he would fling his wig to the floor and kick it around the room in frustration, and probably kick the servant who had done it as well. We're not exactly talking about Prince Charming here. But for Henrietta, this affair represented a chance of salvation, security from her husband. Even though her husband was living in the King's Court, he routinely visited Henrietta's household, demanding money and threatening her with violent behaviour. So Henrietta judged that by becoming the mistress of the Prince of Wales, she might be afforded a measure of protection. She would also enrich herself by being mistress, not so much because of spontaneous romantic gifts from Prince Charming here, but because as mistress, she got a salary. It was a formal position in the Georgian court. You got a salary as mistress, you got a pension when you retired, so it wasn't a bad little earner, really, for Henrietta. But it wasn't an affair of passion. It was observed that the Prince of Wales would visit Mrs. Howard's apartments at precisely 7 o'clock every evening, often striding about his room with his watch in his hand if the stated minute had not arrived. He would then spend precisely 3 hours alone with Mrs. Howard every single evening. You might imagine his wife wasn't particularly happy about this. In fact, Caroline was delighted because she got rid of her husband for 3 hours every evening. And she knew that Mrs. Howard was no threat because the prince adored his wife, actually. He said no other woman was fit to buckle Caroline's shoe, and that included Mrs. Howard. So Henrietta's no threat. She gets her husband off her hands for a few hours every evening. Happy days as far as the Princess of Wales is concerned. So she encourages this affair. It's not done behind her back. It's like, come on, George, it's 7, off you go. Go and see Mrs. Howard. And so he does. But the courtiers are a bit bemused by all of this. And there's a lot of speculation about exactly what is happening during those 3 hours every evening when the Prince of Wales is in Henrietta Howard's apartment. Did they or didn't they, effectively? Some courtiers, it literally splits the court gossips into two. Some say, look, the prince lacks the subtlety to conduct an affair purely for show. Others argued that they were doing nothing more scandalous than playing cards for 3 hours. Well, you can imagine I was rather keen to find out the truth when researching this book. And then one day when I was in the British Library, I found this particular document. And at the end, it was a letter from one of Henrietta's friends and to Mrs. Howard, to Henrietta. And there was a postscript that contained the answer to what was happening between Henrietta and the Prince of Wales. Do you want to know what it is? It's on page 134 of the book. So available for purchase at the end of my talk. During her years at court, Henrietta made some very close friends. They included the lady shown here, Molly Lepel. She was another bright star of the Georgian court. She was married to Lord Hervey, and they had a very large family. They had many, many children, but Lord Hervey, as well as being an established courtier, was also one of the greatest gossips of the age, and his memoirs really open a window into the Georgian court. They make for such wonderful reading. Lord Hervey, though, was very much in Princess Caroline's favour, and he therefore saw Henrietta as a threat. He didn't seem to fully understand that Caroline really encouraged this affair. So he was actually quite waspish about Henrietta. He was one of her kind of enemies, whereas his wife Molly was one of Henrietta's closest friends. And she had many other friends and admirers. We see here, this portrait now hangs at Blickling Hall, Henrietta's birthplace in Norfolk. And you see Henrietta in masquerade costume. And she was incredibly fashionable. As I said, she was very well read, and therefore she attracted some of the leading artists and poets and playwrights of the age, men such as Jonathan Swift, who actually based one of his characters in Gulliver's Travels on Henrietta Howard, and also John Gay, who you see there on the right, who you see in Henrietta's letters. He's always sending her drafts of his plays and poems and saying, what do you think of this? And she's advising him. She's known as a woman of wit and a woman of reason by these literary friends that she attracts. But her closest friend is Alexander Pope, one of the most celebrated literary figures of the age. And I'd like to just share with you a poem that Pope wrote in Henrietta's honour. It was called On a Certain Lady at Court. I know a reasonable woman, handsome and witty, yet a friend, not warped by passion, awed by rumour, not grave through pride or gay through folly, an equal mixture of good humour and sensible, soft melancholy. Has she no faults then, envy says, sir? Yes, she has one, I must aver. When all the world conspires to praise her, the woman's deaf and does not hear. That was by Pope. Well, Pope lived in Twickenham in West London, and he wasn't terribly welcome at court. He was known to have Catholic leanings. It was a Protestant court, so he mostly spent time at his home in Twickenham, and Henrietta spent a lot of time with him there, and whilst there, she conceived the idea of actually buying herself a property in Twickenham. And then, thanks to an uncharacteristic gift from her royal lover, or otherwise, the Prince of Wales, in 1723, when he gave Henrietta £11,000, we're not quite sure why, but he just suddenly did. She bought herself some land close to Alexander Pope's house, and she began building what would become Marble Hill House. Has anybody been to Marble Hill House? Great, a few of you have. Please go. If ever you're in Twickenham or Richmond or thereabouts, it is this beautiful Thameside villa, and it really is exquisite, and it's just been lavishly restored to how it would have been in Henrietta's day, including all the original furnishings, decorations. It really is quite breathtaking. So Henrietta bought this land, and you can see from her correspondence just how involved she was in the construction of Marble Hill and in the design of it. She knows about architecture. And whereas her contemporaries are all building these lavish Palladian villas that are totally impractical, Henrietta makes this a house to be lived in and enjoyed. For example, installing a little breakfast room directly overlooking the River Thames. And you can just imagine her sitting there having her breakfast. But of course, she can't move there because she's still serving at court. And the house is coming on apace. So about 4 years after she'd first bought the land, so 1727, it said that Marble Hill is almost complete. It lacks only a roof. So Alexander Pope reports, because he's constantly visiting the building site for his friend Henrietta. But then suddenly it's down tools in 1727, because news arrives that King George I is dead. He's been to Hanover on one of his many visits, and whilst in Hanover, it is said that he has died from eating too many watermelons. There you go. The Georges all have quite farcical deaths, by the way. That's certainly up there. And so Henrietta's royal suitor, her lover, if he is that, the Prince of Wales, is now King George II. And nobody knows if Henrietta will still be his mistress, if she will retain that title, because now he's king, of course, all bets are off. So Henrietta's builders walk out. Nothing changes, does it? You know, they don't know if they're going to get paid anymore, so down tools, off they go. But actually, George, he still loves his routine. He likes everything as it should be. So, of course, he carries Henrietta on as his mistress. And so, thankfully, Marble Hill is completed a couple of years later. And Henrietta is overjoyed by this, but she's also frustrated because she can't actually live there. She can occasionally visit when she's allowed to go and visit Pope in Twickenham, but otherwise Alexander Pope spends most time in Henrietta's house, and he has parties there and writes to tell Henrietta all about them. Oh, we had a great party in your house last night. Thanks very much. And Henrietta, you can tell her longing to be away from this kind of quite frustrating, confined existence in court so that she can enjoy a more quiet and retired life in Twickenham. And then fortune seems to turn towards her when in 1731 she is free of one of the greatest burdens she has suffered for many years, namely her husband. So they are already estranged, of course. They've been estranged for many years. But now he has done her the good turn of dying. So there's finally no more threat from Charles Howard. And when Henrietta hears of this, she is so delighted that she writes to her friend John Gay, "Everything as yet promises more happiness for the latter part of my life than I have yet had prospect of." She's not exactly the grieving widow, and I can't really blame her. Well, the death of her husband really makes Henrietta desperate to leave court because she no longer needs the protection of her royal lover. The affair has become so irksome to both parties that it's really only carried on because of George's love of routine. And her royal mistress, Caroline, is also standing in her way. You see her there on the left, because Caroline doesn't want Henrietta to resign because she knows that as soon as Henrietta's gone, on the one hand, she's got to then spend time with her husband every evening, which she doesn't want to do. But she also fears that her husband will then find a mistress who really is a threat to Caroline's authority at court. So she tries everything to obstruct Henrietta's resignation. And she is in cahoots with the then Prime Minister. Robert Walpole really is Britain's first Prime Minister. And he and Caroline are running the show. Caroline is the real source of power, more than her husband, George II, the king. So Henrietta is in this frustrating position. Her husband's dead, her beautiful house is built, but she can't enjoy it. She can't leave court. But she's ever been one to take matters into her own hands. And in the year 1734, she comes up with a plan. to escape the court for good. She says that she's ill. She needs to take the waters in Bath. Bath is one of the new spa towns that have sprung up in England, and you go there for your health, but you also go there for society. It's one of the most fashionable towns in the country. And so Henrietta pleads that she's feeling poorly, she really needs to go to take the waters. But while she is in Bath, she makes sure that in one of the many assemblies that are held every evening in Bath, she is seen with a certain gentleman called Lord Bolingbroke. He is King George II's foremost enemy. So he is a political enemy to the king. And of course, at these assemblies, everybody is watching who's talking to who is spending time with who. And so it soon gets back to the royal court that the king's mistress has been dancing with, dining with, talking with the king's enemy, Lord Bolingbroke. Henrietta knows exactly what she's doing. And therefore, when she returns to court in October 1734, in time for the king's birthday celebrations, when she enters the gallery at Kensington Palace, the king turns his back. Now that is very symbolic again. Everybody knows what that means. He's turned his back on his mistress. Surely now Henrietta is out. Well, she does succeed, because now there's nothing even Caroline can do to keep her at court. And when Caroline tries to persuade her, Henrietta says, look, I'm sorry, but, your husband, the king, won't see me. He sees me as an enemy now, so I've done my best, but sorry, I'm going to have to resign. And when George, who you see there on the right, finds out that his wife had actually tried to make Henrietta stay at court, he says, what the devil did you mean by trying to make an old, dull, deaf, peevish beast stay and plague me when I had so good an opportunity of getting rid of her? Charming. This is what you get after a 20-year affair with King George II. Well, Caroline tries one last-ditch attempt to persuade Henrietta not to leave court. And we have a record of the conversation between the Queen and her long-suffering mistress. She says, nobody will want to know you. If you leave the court, you will have no acquaintance. And then when Henrietta basically retorts, some people may show me it was the courtier and not me that was liked. But I cannot say that keeping such acquaintance will be an inducement to keep me at court. She had won the argument. She finally was able to leave court and go to Marble Hill. Caroline reacted with bitterness. I have always heard a great deal of her good sense from other people, she told Lord Hervey, but I never saw her take a sensible step since I knew her. Her going from court was the silliest thing she could do. In fact, it was the most sensible. These would be the happiest years of Henrietta's life. She was able to finally move into Marble Hill House, and actually, she very soon afterwards took a step that shocked everybody, because just a year later, in 1735, she suddenly announced she was getting married again. Now, that was a shock to everybody, because Henrietta had famously suffered at the hands of her violent husband. Surely she would want to enjoy her independence. Well, it seems that she had already fallen in love before she left court with a fellow courtier called George Berkeley, and they married very soon after her retirement from court. She's now in her mid-40s, he's a few years younger, and he's a completely different kettle of fish to her violent husband. He's a very kind man, very affable, and they enjoy 11 years of very happy marriage. And they have such assemblies and supper parties and entertainments at Marble Hill that the delicious kind of revenge for Henrietta against the royal court is that Marble Hill starts to rival St. James's and Windsor and the royal centres. All the fashionable set are now flocking to Marble Hill rather than to the royal family. Alexander Pope remarks, "There is a greater set now at Marble Hill than at Kensington, and God knows when it will end." And the lavish entertainments were all held in these beautiful surrounds. Henrietta had impeccable taste, and she had appointed the house, as you see here, in these newly restored interiors. And there were supper parties, there was music recitals, of course there was tea. Taking tea and cake now became all the rage in Georgian society, and Henrietta is actually shown in the centre of this painting of a tea party at one of the residences where she visited. Well, very sadly, in 1746, so after 11 years of marriage, as I mentioned, George Berkeley dies. Even though he'd been younger than Henrietta, he'd suffered from gout, he hadn't been in particularly good health, and Henrietta was grief-stricken by the loss of her beloved second husband. And really, she was never the same again from that time onwards. But she did have some solace in the form of a new companion who the following year moved to Twickenham and had this rather Gothic fantasy building constructed. Strawberry Hill, again you may have visited, was the home of Horace Walpole, the son of the Prime Minister. And he and Henrietta became the best of friends. He would visit Marble Hill nearly every evening, and he loved to hear her reminiscences of court, of her years at court, and he actually later published these after Henrietta's death. And in 1763, Henrietta also had some other company at Marble Hill in the form of her niece, who was called Henrietta in honour of her aunt, and she spent a lot of time at Marble Hill, and really she adored her aunt, who was becoming increasingly frail and almost entirely deaf now, but she still liked to regale her niece with tales of the court, and the young Henrietta absolutely lapped them up. And you can still see the little bedroom at Marble Hill that the elder Henrietta appointed for the younger. There's no detail is overlooked. It's an absolutely exquisite little bedroom overlooking the parkland of Marble Hill. Horace Walpole, Henrietta's friend in later life, was one of the last people to see her alive. He paid a visit to his old friend in July 1767, and he found her much changed that evening. She didn't seem herself, but he didn't find any great cause for concern, so he took his leave as usual at the end of the evening, and he then was grief-stricken to hear of her death later that evening. And his life was really never the same again. And he published, as I mentioned, the reminiscences, as he called them, that Henrietta Howard had shared with him of all her years serving the Prince of Wales and the King George II, and of course Queen Caroline. Henrietta chose to be buried not at Marble Hill, but at Berkeley Castle, which was the ancestral seat of her second husband. She wanted to be buried next to George Berkeley. And I apologise for the next slide because you can barely read it, but it's the inscription on the tomb of Henrietta, and it really attests to the love that she had for her second husband. This is the most famous portrait of Henrietta, and it's the reason I wrote the book, actually, because then, oh gosh, we're talking how many years ago? Probably 2004, 20 years ago, when I was working for English Heritage, and I visited Marble Hill in my early days there when I was trying to do the rounds of the 413 sites that English Heritage looks after. And I went to Marble Hill and I just saw this portrait on the wall. I thought, gosh, she looks like an interesting woman. I wonder who she is. And then I started reading about her, and then the idea for the book. And so it all started really with this beautiful portrait of Henrietta, painted when she was in her mid-30s. She was a woman of reason in an age of reason, an extraordinarily brave, self-sacrificing, resilient and resourceful woman who I think inspires other generations to follow. And it's been a real joy revisiting her today, because it's many, many years, actually, since I've given a talk on Henrietta. I've since moved on. I tend to dwell in the Tudor period rather a lot more than the Georgian period. But in revisiting her, it has been a joy. And it reminded me of the kind of feeling of being bereft when I finished the book, because I felt like I knew her. It felt like she'd become a friend when I was reading all of those letters in the British Library. And it called to mind the reflection of Horace Walpole when he heard of Henrietta's death, and I'd like to share it with you now. It was an essential loss to me, who is deprived of a most agreeable friend with whom I passed many hours. In truth, I never knew a woman more respectable for her honour and principles, and have lost few persons in my life whom I shall miss so much. I feel exactly the same. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much. You can see why the books are so readable, can't you? Those details. And when you rush out and get your copy in a moment, don't forget, check that it's got page 134 in it. I'm sure all the men are soon going to rush home and ask for their underwear to be numbered now. But before you do that, Dr. Borman has very graciously consented to answer any questions. And I think if I give the microphone to Petra, she's got one, there's a roving mic. If you stick your hand up, the microphone will come to you.
Yeah.
Just two questions.
Yeah.
What happened to her son?
Yes, her son predeceased her. So he died, I think, about 11, 12 years before Henrietta, and they were completely estranged. Henrietta had tried to make contact with him again after her husband's death, but he just wouldn't. And actually, he seems to have taken after his father. He was known to be violent. He had a terrible temper. He hadn't been raised in the best of circumstances.
And second question, who did her estate go to when she died?
Her estate went to her niece, the younger Henrietta. And then later on, it was leased to another royal mistress, Maria Fitzherbert, who was the long-standing mistress, rumoured secret wife of King George IV. And so it had a bit of a history of being the home of royal mistresses. And they have now changed it, but for many years, English Heritage had one of those information panels up in the grounds of Marble Hill. And they described Marble Hill as a love nest, and that it was built by George II for his mistress, Henrietta. She built it to get away from him. And so luckily they've changed the wording of that now, because, yeah, it's got an association, though, with royal mistresses. Thank you. We'll be with you in 1 second, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you got that one.
Did you say that she became pregnant with her second husband? Did she become pregnant with her second husband?
No, she didn't become pregnant. No, she only had. Oh, I'm going to give away page 134. She only had one acknowledged child, Henry Howard, from her first marriage. No children from her second marriage. No, I mean she was by then in her mid-40s, which today is certainly not too old to give birth, but it was way beyond what was seen as the conventional kind of childbearing years, really, in the 18th century. Any other questions? There's a lady just over there.
Thanks, that was absolutely amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Have there ever been any television or film adaptations of her? Has anybody optioned your book? I mean, it seems completely ripe for somebody to make a film or television.
It would be such a dream come true. They haven't, is the short answer, because unless there are any TV commissioners in today. But it doesn't get past the, oh, who's Henrietta Howard? Never heard of her. You know, and that's it. And if you actually explore her story, it's so dramatic, and it's not rags to riches. It's sort of the other way around, and it's this wonderful life. But to date, no. If anybody does know anyone who works in TV or film, just have a word, because that would be an absolute. I think it deserves to be on screen, actually. Yeah.
We are married. What's the court language at that time? Would you have to learn German? Or?
No, it's a good question. The court language was English, certainly under George II, Henrietta's sort of royal suitor. George I never learned English. He didn't want, as I say, didn't want to be in England. He surrounded himself with German attendants. But even so, most of the courtiers were English, and it was a source of some resentment. You know, their new king was making no effort, whereas George II, he very quickly learned English, so did Caroline, and they kind of embraced all things English until George II became king, and then he hated England and kept going back to Hanover and became exactly like his father, which seemed to be the pattern between father and son. And I should say, sorry, this is just lowering the tone again, but I talked about the stupid deaths of the Georgians. George II, I should say, predeceased Henrietta. He died in 1760 at Kensington Palace, and he died on the toilet, just like Elvis. So there you go. Yeah, they all had. And then his son, who would have been the successor, Prince Frederick, he died after being hit on the head with a cricket ball. So there you go. You couldn't make it up. Sorry. Any other questions? Yes. There's, oh, yeah. Please, I can't see very well at the back. So, yeah.
So when George II went to Europe, was she required to follow him as part of the entourage, or did she get time off?
Stayed behind all the time. So I think she kind of encouraged him to go, as did Caroline. And it's interesting that when Henrietta did finally manage to leave court, exactly what Caroline feared happened. And George found a new mistress, Madame Valmorden, a Hanoverian mistress, who was much more influential than Henrietta had been. So Caroline had kind of been right, her instinct had been right to keep Henrietta. But no, he went alone. And then on one of those visits, he met his future German mistress. And there was a
You mentioned about her brother. She was very close to him.
Yeah.
What happened with the family, the relationship with her brother and the rest of the family once she was married and had moved on to be the mistress?
Yes, that's right. So her brother became sort of master of Blickling Hall and really restored the family's fortunes there that his father had really kind of frittered away. It was his daughter, I should have said, who was Henrietta, Henrietta, the elder Henrietta's niece. So, and he went on to have. I think there are still Hobarts around today. In fact, I certainly met one of them when I first published this book. And so really the Hobart family fortune was restored by Henrietta's brother John, and he had many children. He became a diplomat. He spent a lot of time in Russia, and his letters are absolutely fascinating back to Henrietta. So they became very close. Sadly, because Henrietta was one of 9 children, but she lost most of her siblings in childhood. Infant mortality was still very high, but she and John remained close. Any other questions at all? You're all being very punctual. Yes, there's a lady just on the front. Yeah, 5 minutes left, yeah.
I was just interested that in that time she was allowed to own property in her own right, even though she was married.
Yes, you're right. She was allowed to own property, which was very rare, actually, for the time. But thanks to it being a gift from the king, and basically enabled her to buy the land outright, and it was really her unique status at the court, because otherwise this was not an age where women could legally really own property or estates. But that's one thing she had to be thankful to her royal suitor for. It kind of almost gave her an exclusive status in that respect. And I love the fact that she then was able to bequeath it to her niece, but it did then kind of fall out of the family and it was just sort of leased after that. But yeah, it gave her independence, which I think is wonderful. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
That was completely brilliant.
Oh,
thank you
you
so much. And I'm a Hobart.
Oh!
And Sir John Hobart is sitting over there.
Yes! Fantastic. Oh, there you go. That's amazing. From the same Hobarts. The Hobarts are still alive. It's a good job I wasn't rude about the Hobarts, isn't it? Thank you so much for introducing us. Well, please come and say hello afterwards. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. I think, what a way to finish. Sorry, but I'm gonna, no, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you very much indeed. Wonderful.